Our speaker tonight, and he's going to come and lead us in that.
So our reading is from Luke chapter 22, and we're going to read verses 63 to 71. The men who were guarding Jesus began mocking and beating him. They blindfolded him and demanded, "Prophesy! Who hit you?" And they said many other insulting things to him. At daybreak, the council of the elders of the people, both the chief priests and the teachers of the law, met together, and Jesus was led before them. "If you are the Messiah," they said, "tell us." Jesus answered, "If I tell you, you will not believe me. And if I asked you, you would not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the mighty God." They all asked, "Are you then the Son of God?" He replied, "You say that I am." Then they said, "Why do we need any more testimony? We have heard it from his own lips." This is the word of the Lord.
Good evening. I'm going to do what Kate did and leave my notes down there. But I've got a few things on the screen to show you. I'm David. Sally and I are part of this congregation, as are 5 children, 2 of which are here. When we were talking about our favourite places, home was one and church was another. So everyone who's a member of this church or a staff member at this church, then that's a compliment. The title I was given is Jesus on Trial, and that's the title we're going with. If you find me boring, then, or if you've got children here, there's a couple of children's sheets at the back. They're on the small table, and you're welcome to grab one of those if you'd like to. And the reason we moved to this area is because I work for Barnabas Aid, and some of the illustrations and examples that I'll use this evening will come from that work. Barnabas Aid are an international aid agency who help suffering Christians, including persecuted Christians. And those 2 words we're going to come back to in the context of what we read, thank you, Anna, about what happened to Jesus. So Jesus on trial, and this is wordy, but what we're going to do is consider 10 twos. So each of these, there are 2. So there are 2 scenes, 2 systems. Some of them are classifications, and then we'll end with one conclusion. And I'm going to make a start because we don't have that long. So the 2 scenes are this, and if you were here last week, we had a number of scenes up at the front with Matt Britton going through Mark's Gospel. There's 2 settings for this reading, and the first is at the high priest's house, and that's at night. And then the second scene is after daybreak has broken, after the day broke, and that's at the council of the elders of the people. And you'll see why that's important, and partly the reason why that's important is because there were 2 systems here, 2 legal systems. Are there any lawyers in the house? I know there's lawyers in the congregation. You don't have to put your hand up. But I'm not a lawyer, so I stand to be corrected. But Jesus was not a victim. Jesus was not a victim. Jesus was the target of a conspiracy, and it required the conflation of 2 legal systems for Jesus to be killed in the way that he was killed on a cross. And what we saw in this chapter, or these few verses from this chapter, was that Jesus was accused of what? Blasphemy. You couldn't be crucified on the charge of blasphemy. So what we'll see as we lead up to Easter and come to church, come to the services or listen online, I'm often not here, but I listen online, we'll see how the situation was changed, the situation was manipulated so that Jesus could actually be crucified. So the charge of blasphemy changed, and it ended up being a charge of treason. So I'm not a lawyer, and this is as wordy as the slides will get, but these two systems were misused in order that Jesus could be abused. The systems were misused. The trial couldn't be held at night, hence that council had to wait until the daytime. But pre-trial interrogations were not lawful. Anything that would, if somebody was found guilty, mean that they would be murdered, would be killed, that couldn't happen during a major festival. What major festival was it? It was mentioned this morning. Passover. So it couldn't have happened. It shouldn't have happened, nor on the eve of a Sabbath. And if guilt meant you would die, then there needed to be an adjournment of 12 hours. And that didn't happen. And you'll see all this as we go through Luke's account of the Passion. And what we saw these council, the chief priests and the teachers of the law, trying to do was to get from Jesus a confession. But the confession from the accused was not admissible in any case, and we'll see how Jesus responded or not. So, two scenes. One was at night, and that was at the house of the high priest, and then at daybreak we read that this council was assembled. But the two systems were abused, they were conflated, they were abused so that Jesus could be tried for treason rather than for blasphemy. And that's why he was killed on a cross. Why did he need to be killed why did he need to be put on a cross? We read in Galatians 3 verse 13 that anyone who is hung on a tree is cursed. Jesus became a curse for us. It's a word we don't use very often, but he needed to be killed in that way to take the curse of sin upon himself. Okay, two forms of abuse, and here's a question for you. To which forms of abuse, so in these few verses, to which forms of abuse was Jesus subjected? Okay, let me maybe help you. There's a hand at the back. Physical and mental, physical and psychological. You don't need to put your hands up, but thank you for doing so. I'm quite used to being interrupted, so I really don't mind. Gethsemane, that was the spiritual aspect, and we looked at that with Andy recently. But this was physical and psychological, and one could say that when Jesus was blindfolded, that's a combination of the two. It's something physical which has a very psychological impact, because you don't know how to brace yourself from which side the strike is going to come because you're blindfolded. Which was worse? You don't have to answer that question. It's more rhetorical. Jesus won this battle in the Spirit in the Garden of Gethsemane. Now, I'm not undermining the physical nor the psychological, but that's where he won it. That's where he won this battle, and then it was a case of going through the physical and the psychological together with the spiritual. Okay, so there were two statements. One was a question, and one was not. They amount to the same thing. If you are the Messiah, tell us, and are you then the Son of God? How did Jesus respond? He called out their hypocrisy. His teaching and his miracles had proven that he was the Messiah, but they didn't believe him. So he called out their hypocrisy, but he did it in such a way as to let them know that he knew he would win. From this time, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand. We don't always need to respond when the accusations come. And one of the things that we should pray and ask God to give us and ask God to give others who are in situations, might say harder or more acute than us, is wisdom. Whether to respond, whether to speak. If so, what to say, when to say it, to whom to say it, at what volume, or in what setting or context. The second column on the right is a bit more practical, but this fifth set of twos is two prophecies. And this is what we've looked at earlier on in Luke. Luke 18, Jesus took the 12 aside and he told them, we're going to Jerusalem. And he said that the Son of Man himself would be delivered over to the Gentiles. He would be mocked, insulted, and spat on him. And although we don't have that reed spitting in this account in Luke, we know that that's what happened to him. So this prophecy is now being fulfilled. Jesus was being mocked. Jesus was being insulted. And then he also said to his disciples that everyone will hate you because of me. They didn't understand in this first one when he told them what would happen to him, but I think they would have had an incentive to try and understand this one. But not a hair of your head will perish. Stand firm and you will win life. Jesus had just before this said to them, some of you will be killed on account of me. So not a hair of your head perishing isn't talking about the physical. It's talking about that which lasts. There will be no eternal loss, is what Jesus said. Now listen, just partly because it's quite a heavy subject, and partly because I want to check you're still with me. I'm going to ask you two questions, and so then at the end there's going to be two answers. But what I want you to do is just imagine that you're like Peter. So in other words, you're loud. You don't so much think and internalize. You speak aloud, and when you speak aloud, you do it loudly. All right? So I'd like you to do it all together. Ready? Say pots. Good, not bad. Spell pots.
PTS.
Good. Okay, let's just do that a few more times. Say pots.
Pots.
Spell pots.
POTS.
In time. Say pots.
Pots.
Spell pots.
POTS.
A little bit louder, because remember you're being like Peter. Say pots. Pots. Spell pots. POTS. What do you do at the green light? Now, I threw in a third question that tricked you, and there'll be no trick questions after this, which threw us. Now, I think we go at the green light. But why? I don't know, I just find it interesting, but it shows me you're still awake. And the answers that come to our minds aren't always, well, the first answer isn't always the correct one, and I've got a couple more questions to ask. This gets a bit more practical now. Two questions, and I said I would draw on some Barnabas Aid examples. This is Jermaine, and just to go back, did that work? The back one? There we are. Okay, so I remember as a child growing up in church and being taught about persecution, but it seemed to be theoretical. It seemed to be something that wasn't applicable to life today. And what brought it home to me was traveling to Pakistan, where I can travel without a visa, and association with Nigerians and those working in Nigeria. And just to take us from the theoretical to the practical, I've got a couple of examples, and I've shown you the first already. This is Jermaine. She's got 5 children. She's a widow. And she said that she's 50 years old, and this is the first time in her life that she has a Bible. I don't know how many Bibles you have at home. We've got lots, and it's a good thing. But to be grateful for the resources that we have, and with that gratitude, then not to take those resources for granted. She prayed that God would give her a Bible, and it's done now. This is Meng. He's from Myanmar. In his 80s, after 68 years of praying, God has answered my prayers, and he received a free Bible. Twice he was able to get one within those 68 years. The first time the authorities burned it, or one time the authorities burned it, and another time the authorities threw it in a river. And only in his 80s did he receive his first Bible. Now let me bring it back to Leamington and just talk about types of suffering. In this world, we all suffer because while God holds the world in his hands, and we were singing that earlier, who has held the oceans in his hands? The answer is God. He hasn't dropped the world, but we know that this world in which we live is fallen. It's broken, it's fragile. But it's not so fragile that when the world fell, God went back to a divine box and decided to get out another one. He didn't do that. He fixed the broken, fragile, hurting world. He fixed this broken, fragile, hurting world. Everybody suffers, whoever they are. I was 50 towards the end of last year, and as I get older, I see more suffering. We all suffer. So these two types of suffering I'm going to suggest are this: the suffering that we all undergo, and then the additional suffering that Christians are called and even commissioned to endure. So we suffer in the world because it's fallen. But Christians are called also to suffer with the world. What does that mean? It means compassion. It's beyond pity and empathy, and it's standing alongside people when they suffer. As Christians, we're called to suffer with the world. And we're also called to suffer for the world. Now, what does that mean? It means this. Let's say Jonathan, take your pick, and I have the same health condition. And Jonathan has the medicine. I don't. Jonathan gives me the medicine, knowing that in giving the medicine to me, there's none for him. Jonathan, in that instance, is choosing to suffer for me instead of me. And as Christians, we're called to do that. And we're also called, and as we go through Luke's gospel in these next few weeks, we're also called to suffer in another way. And it's the hardest, it's the ugliest, it's nitty-gritty. We are called to suffer by the world. We are called to do it, commissioned to do it. Jesus said, everyone will hate you because of me. Paul told Timothy, and we don't even have to live a godly life. Simply the desire to live a godly life, and I say that to encourage us because we all fall, and we'll end up with that in a moment. The desire to live a godly life means that we will be persecuted. We are called to suffer at the hands of the world. Intentional suffering, which need not happen and needs somebody to perpetrate that suffering, is a calling upon us as Christians. Suffering is in the world, and whether we're in Leamington or Libya, we'll suffer. But we're also called as Christians, wherever we are, to suffer alongside the world with them, to suffer for them, and to suffer by them, at the hands of them, and because of the world. Now, Jesus' suffering, we often talk about his suffering on the cross, and it's true, but it was that specific kind of suffering. It was persecution. It was intentional, and it caused somebody to do it. That's the suffering. So on the cross, Jesus was persecuted. It was suffering in general terms, but it was persecution. And it was unique. We won't have to go, you could say there are 10 stages of suffering, and we'll see as we go through Luke what they are leading up to the cross and then on the cross. But here are 2 of those 10 that Jesus calls us to go through. Jesus' suffering was unique. Now, this is a bit theological. Jesus' suffering was for propitiation, the removal of wrath, satisfying God's righteous anger. Our suffering does not do that. It's another P word, and we'll come to it in a minute. But Jesus did say to his disciples, anyone who wants to follow me must deny themselves and take up their cross. So we have to do that, and we have to do that daily. Wherever, whoever, however long we've been following, we do that daily. And then this one I think is specific or helpful in this context, because no doubt Jesus, having commanded his disciples not to decide not to worry about what they're going to say. To make their mind up, not to worry. To make their mind up, not to worry. And we were praying about fear earlier. Jesus himself must have done that. Jesus' suffering was unique, and we don't have to satisfy God's wrath. We couldn't if we tried. But what does our suffering do? What our suffering does is it draws people not to us, but it draws people to Jesus. When we suffer, even suffering persecution, and then we maintain our faith, we hold on to our faith, then people see our lives and they are drawn to Jesus. This is a story, it's not a typical martyr story. But there's a Christian who's living in Lahore called Michael. Michael's job is to clean the sewers. But Michael was sent to clean the sewers without the protective equipment he needs to do that. And because of that, the toxic fumes rendered him unconscious. Michael was denied the equipment because he was Christian. And none of Michael's colleagues would go in to the sewer to help him, not because the sewage would make them dirty, but because touching Michael, the Christian, would make them dirty. I sometimes lecture medical students in Pakistan, and even in this context, where we're training people, I was trained and we train to treat whoever comes to you. Even in that context, Christians are denied treatment and die. The only two people who would go to help Michael were Faisal and Nadeem, also Christian, also denied the protective equipment that they need, and they both died. And our organization's helping their families who've lost their breadwinners. It's not a typical martyr story, but Michael wouldn't have been put in that situation. Faisal and Nadeem wouldn't have died had they not been Christian. Suffering is a reality. Discrimination for many Christians around the world is a reality. I'll have some resources at the back just to help us to pray for Christians in different nations. 2 outcomes. What are the 2 outcomes? Remember Peter. Thanks for this morning, Eleanor. Remember Peter. The 2 outcomes are whether we will stand or whether we will fall. Not a hair of your head will perish. And then verse 19 in Luke 21, stand firm and you will win life. God knows that we stumble. He knows that we fall. He knows that we can be slow to obey. So he's not asking us for perfection. He doesn't expect it. He knows we couldn't do that. What does he want? He wants those who, no matter what flaming arrows are sent our way, will stand firm. And even though we may fall, and even though we may at times go in the wrong direction, when Jesus returns to the earth, he's looking for faith. He's looking for those who've kept the faith, no matter what the circumstances may be. Some of us here have been following Jesus longer than I've been alive. And others are very much at the beginning of our journeys. But I'm going to ask us to stand. We did it for praying, and I'll ask us to do it again. Enacting in the physical, an intention in the spiritual, to stand firm, no matter what suffering, taking our inspiration from Jesus. Remember this, persecution, that intentional, awful suffering, because of Jesus. And if we choose to endure, persecution is always both incomplete and unsuccessful. The enemy thought he'd won. He didn't. I remember I said there'd be another P word. It's propagation. If you're a gardener, you'll like it. Jesus took away the wrath of God. And when we suffer for being a Christian, or just the suffering that goes on in this world, and bear witness to the God who helps us in that suffering, and commit ourselves to becoming like him in that suffering, we propagate the gospel. People say, I would like to know this God who you serve, who you will not deny, even if it means your life. So let's stand as we move into the final parts of our service. we can ask the question, God, do you care about what happens to me or my family, about what happens to Christians around the world? God, do you know? God, do you care? Remember that God is always informed. He knows. And he's always involved. And his involvement, the cross of Jesus shows us, is an involvement of intervention. He didn't stay in heaven, he intervened. Jesus came into our broken, sinful, fragile world to change the course of history, to extend God's kingdom, and to bring many to be daughters and sons of our God. So as we pray, as we sing rather, remember that the one conclusion is this: God's love is vast, beyond all measure. Even when we fall, especially when we fall, Peter fell and was reinstated. We caused Jesus our sin. We caused him to suffer the suffering of persecution on the cross. And why did he do it? Because his love for us is so great. It's so great. And he wants others to know that same love. So as we sing this song, let's remember, amidst all these words, that the one conclusion is God loves us. And each one of us can say, God, you love me. Amen.